Hi, everyone. I'm Steve Koepp, a co-founder of From Day One, our forum on corporate values, and we're looking forward to hosting today's webinar. But before we get started, I want to share something special we have for attendees of today's webinar. Our next monthly virtual conference is coming up next month on Wednesday, July 21st, and it's titled Diversity's Many Roles: How Mentors, Sponsors, and Allies Each Play a Part in Inclusion. Thanks to our partners and today's sponsor, we have some complimentary VIP tickets available for those who've joined today's webinar. That's you, and I'm putting a link in the chat right now. You'll want to take advantage of this one. The regular price for our conference tickets is $149, and this link will give you a free VIP ticket for the whole day's activities. And now on to today's webinar. We'll be exploring a topic that focuses on corporate leadership and the LGBTQ community. Our titles for today's session is Toward a More Exclusive LGBTQ Outlook in Corporate America. While employers fly their rainbow flags right now during Pride Month, questions should still be asked. In what substantial ways could they be making a stronger commitment? LGBTQ workers are still often slighted and isolated in workplaces. What can be done about that, as well as bringing more LGBTQ executives into the top ranks of leadership? Which companies are the role models for including transgender employees? Should corporate leaders speak out strongly in favor of the Equality Act in Congress, as they've done for racial justice? These are some of the questions we'll be looking at today. Our sponsor today is Bravely. I'll tell you a bit about them. Bravely connects your people to on-demand confidential coaching in the moments that define the employee experience. Access to Bravely's network of vetted professional coaches fosters employee well-being and development to supercharge performance and help people thrive at work. When leading organizations offer Bravely to everyone, they scale the support offered by their people teams and transform their cultures in an evolving world of work. Now, a few logistical items. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand soon after the event, so you can look out for an email in about 24 hours with a link. That email will also have info on how you can get professional development credits for this session from the Society of Human Resource Management. And look out for a written account of the conversation soon on our website, which is at fromday1.co. At the top of the hour, we'll begin a Q&A session. You can submit your questions anytime during this webinar using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator of distinction, Lydia Dishman, a contributing editor for Fast Company, on topics including tech, leadership, the workplace. She's written for CBS Money Watch, for Fortune, Popular Science, and the New York Times, among others. Okay, Lydia, take it away.
Thank you so much, Steve, and thanks everybody for joining us today. We are thrilled to have you on board with us for this very timely and important discussion. As Steve said, despite the visibility of rainbow flags, in the absence of sweeping federal legislation and several recent legislative measures that aim to curtail rights, LGBTQ workers are still under threat on the job. In fact, in more than half of US states, you can be fired for being gay or trans. So it's no surprise that many LGBTQ workers choose to check that part of their identity at the door when they head to the office. And diversity and inclusion initiatives aside, it falls on business leaders, regardless of orientation, to take up the mantle of advocating for LGBTQ rights in the workplace and to make those workplaces more inclusive. I recently had the opportunity to interview one of them, Pfizer's Chief Corporate Affairs Officer, Sally Sussman, who was ranked #2 on Fast Company's Queer 50 list for her influence and advocacy in the community. And she told me that an important part of what she does in both her personal and professional life is to be visible. She told me, it's been a lifelong journey to be out and outspoken, and it's something I'll never stop doing. So while we're grateful to have leaders like Sally who are out proud and shining a spotlight on LGBTQ workers, corporate America has a long way to go to be more inclusive. So here to discuss how to make sustainable strides toward this goal is a stellar group of professionals who have plenty of insights on best practices and opportunities. So I'm going to go around the virtual room and ask them to introduce themselves, briefly tell us about your work and your advocacy for the LGBTQ+ community. Dr. Toni D'orsay, I would like to start with you.
Hi, I'm Dr. Toni D'orsay. I am the Director of Trans Services for Borrego Health in California. I am also the creator of the Trans 100, which I haven't been doing lately, but still exists and still has some impact. And what I do is I am in charge of all of the trans programs for Borrego Health, and ultimately I influence trans programs for all other companies and organizations within the same region as we build up a network of suppliers and vendors and resources for the community here. I've been doing this work for a very long time. I've worked with the White House, with the United Nations, done all that wonderful fun stuff that we all just do it. But I'm not really interested in being the one that shines. I'm interested in making the people that we help shine.
Awesome, thank you. Yvette, why don't you go next?
Hello, thank you for having me. My name is Yvette Miley. I am the Senior Vice President at the NBCU News Group in charge of diversity, equity, and inclusion, working specifically with the employees and the brands represented by MSNBC, CNBC, and NBC News. And I am late to being who I am in terms of my sexuality. And I think what I do in terms of advocacy is trying to live my truth in a way that I didn't when I first started this business.
Thank you for sharing that, very important. Chad, why don't you go next?
Thanks, Lydia. It's an honor to be with you all. Chad Hugh, pronouns are he and him. I currently serve with the YMCA of San Francisco as Senior Vice President for Strategy, Innovation, and Impact. But before that, I served 10 years with the YMCA's national office in Chicago in diversity inclusion. I have the honor of serving on the board of directors for Howard Brown Health, one of the nation's largest LGBTQ-focused federally qualified healthcare centers, and also the board of the Tyler Clemente Foundation, aiming to end bullying for all people, but especially LGBTQ youth. And like a lot of you on the line, I think I'm really much focused on how to tell my authentic story in hopes that my story will give others a chance for their own light to shine. And now in this time of polarization, of challenge and social strife, one of the ways to light up the darkness is to let our own light shine even more authentically than ever before. It's an honor to be with you all.
Thank you. I should have asked at the beginning. I know that we're going to handle this as a question later on, but to introduce with our preferred pronouns, I'm she, her. If we want to go back, talk to Toni. Do you want to quickly say yours and Yvette?
My pronouns are Empress, Your Royal Majesty, and thank you. May I have another? But I do settle for she and her for your comfort.
I use her Majesty at home. Thank you for that.
Still Your Majesty.
Yvette?
He, her, and hers. I want to steal Your Majesty, though.
I think we all want to. Toby, why don't you go next?
Hi, everybody. I'm Toby Harvey. My pronouns are he, him. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Bravely. We're partnering today with From Day One on the event. We care a lot about LGBTQ inclusion for a lot of reasons. Part of why companies bring Bravely on board is to support underrepresented population, underrepresented employees in their companies, and provide confidential coaching and safe pathways and more equitable access to such a powerful development opportunity. So it's a cause that's near and dear to us as an organization and our mission. I was also on the board of Out in Tech for 6 years and served as president for 2. Out in Tech is a nonprofit dedicated to LGBTQ representation and inclusion in the tech industry. And I was part of helping go from a completely volunteer organization with 1 chapter to 20,000 members globally and 12 chapters and full-time staff and lots of great partnerships. And the team deserves the credit for the work, but it was an honor to be part of that journey. And I'm also an out gay man. And so all of these topics and the work that I do and all of it is, you know, in the conversation we're having here today is very personal for me too.
Thank you. And thank you for the work you're doing. Last but not least, Natalie.
Thank you, Lydia. Thanks for having me. Hello, everyone. My name is Natalie Edwards. My pronouns are she, her. I'm currently the Global Chief Diversity Officer of a company called National Grid, which is an energy company leading the clean energy transition. So I'm really excited about that. It's actually my 3rd company leading diversity and inclusion in corporate settings. Many moons ago, I consulted the Obama administration on HR and DEI strategy within federal agencies. And then I was at the Wharton School at UPenn, not only getting my MBA, but also leading diversity strategy through things we all remember, like Charlottesville and the Muslim ban and not so pleasant days in American history. But most recently, I joined National Grid in January from the Estee Lauder companies, where worldwide I was responsible for not only enhancing and enriching the global beauty standard, which we know has historical and very present repercussions, but I'm a really big believer in visibility and giving people platforms to feel beautiful. And so I work directly with brands in my portfolio like MAC Cosmetics, Smashbox, as well as some brands in the portfolio that weren't very loud on LGBTQ issues and equality. So I am an ally here today on the panel, and I try to be one every day in my life. But I'm here speaking to the folks that are in the audience that want to know how they can do the work. And I'm excited to share to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Chris. That's a great introduction. And I should have said I'm an ally as well. So I hope to do this discussion justice. And to kick it off, I wanted to start by setting context, because over the last year, particularly since the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and then on through the fight for racial justice, and then the violence against Asian American Pacific Islanders. And now we move into this Pride Month. There's been a lot of performance around diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's been a lot of proclamations made, but the actual work seems to be a very different thing, different entity. So my first question to all of you is, let's talk a little bit about how you view inclusion and some of the best practices that you've encountered that can make leaders more intentionally inclusive, especially with regards to the lens we have over this past year, which I think has really been a game changer. At least I hope it has. So we're doing round robin again. Yvette, I'm going to start with you.
I think inclusion is experiential. It's like, how do I feel? How do you make me feel? Do I feel heard, valued, and seen? So I think for me, what I try to ask myself, when we follow the social construct of calendars, everyone has a month in their honor, right? What are you doing in that month might be your focus, but you should ask yourself, what are you doing the 11 months of the year, right? Like if you're celebrating Pride or you're doing something specific to celebrate Pride, what are you doing the other 11 months of the year to make members of that community feel included, heard, and seen, not just with the parade or just with cupcakes in the conference room or whatever it is that you might do to celebrate. So I think for me, inclusion is an ongoing, continuous journey. It's not one thing alone. It's a series of things. It's getting to systemic issues within your organization that prevent your organization from really being inclusive. So look beyond the month is what my advice would be, and what I try to do. Look beyond the month.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Absolutely. Chad?
No, so I think Yvette teed it up perfectly. I would say, yes, look beyond the month, and let's look at inclusion in 3 parallel tracks, right? And Yvette teed this up also: individual, organizational, and societal. When we look at how inclusion can manifest in real systems change, sometimes it's easier to talk about policies and practices at an organizational level than to do the individual work of confronting our own biases. The hurt, the pain, and the beauty that comes from the cumulative sum of our lived experiences must be channeled into everything that we do. And of course, in the nonprofit sector, in the world that all of us live and work in, society, right? We don't exist to serve ourselves. We don't exist to employ ourselves. We exist to serve an engaged community. And so individual, organizational, societal, and that's actually the framework of the YMCA's equity approach that YUSA has and pioneers, Michael Farris and Victor Rivera from that team. The other thing that I would say is sometimes when we think about systems versus symptoms, performative, Lydia, to your point, we are so good at addressing the symptoms, and we do it over and over again every June, every March, every May, and we wonder why the systems don't change. And I think with the organizations that are represented here, we really are starting to move from performative efforts into real long-term, actual systemic efforts.
Toby?
Yeah, I'd say to pulling on that thread a little bit, I sometimes maybe over optimistically think about some of these performative declarations or statements, or like changing your logo for the month of June as a starting point and like the baseline. And like maybe there are just a lot of organizations that are still in that phase one. And for me, and there's a lot of research showing almost like the power of this like Maslow's hierarchy of needs around like your, as an organization, your commitment and delivery on your promises of inclusion, like starting with that baseline of these public statements and very basic non-discrimination policies against LGBTQ employees or other marginalized groups. The second being more about the infrastructure, things like your benefits packages and your ERGs. And then the top of the pyramid, and where it feels like there's so much work to do, is around initiatives, policies, things that embed cultural change in day-to-day interactions and micro behaviors in key relationships and between individuals in an organization outside of the month of June. So, performative certainly resonates with me. And if I put my Pollyanna hat on, I like to think like this is just step one, and we're on our way to something that is deeper and more systemic and really serves to drive change long term.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to sort of detract from the efforts of some organizations that are just starting, as you said, to recognize that there even is a month to, take a beat and see people.
Yeah, and we can both celebrate them and expect them to move a little faster and catch up. Yeah.
Natalie, your thoughts?
Well, I don't want to be repetitive of what was already said, but I agree with everything that was already discussed. And I love what Yvette said about the other 11 months, because if we're honest, even the best effort during Pride Month, the progress that's made during 1 month can easily be outweighed by the harm that's done the 11 months that it's not a focus, right? But what I wanted to say was, we all know that, like, I like to say diversity is a fact, inclusion is a behavior. And what I always see in many organizations is, diversity, people know it matters and agree with it, but there's a behavior change that has yet to occur. And that's where the majority of the harm is done. And so I agree with the systems and the symptoms. I'm going to steal that, Chad. But ultimately, the systems run based off of people's behavior as well, right? As well, paired with the process. And so for me, one thing I'm really excited about in terms of the best practice that I see bubbling up in popularity, and I hope to see it continue, and I'm certainly investing in it in my own company that I'm running with diversity, is more workshop-based learning, because I think, pre-2020 and pre-2021 diversity training was mostly lecture-based. Here's what unconscious bias is. Here's what you do that harms different communities. And what I keep hearing from folks is, hey, Natalie, I want to be an inclusive leader, but I'm afraid of doing it wrong, so I'm going to sit on the sidelines. And so asking yourself and your company, look at the agenda of trainings, conversations, any sort of educational opportunity around inclusion, specific to the LGBTQ community, or more holistically across underrepresented groups, and look at how much time you're giving people in the organization to actually practice, to roll up their sleeves, whether it's breakout rooms and role playing or simulations, because ultimately that's how you learn. So that way, when you're on your teams and doing this for real, you're not as terrified because you've done it before. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's what I see bubbling up, and I'm excited to see hopefully drive the behavior changes that will actually add up to real change on a day-to-day basis for folks.
Mm-hmm. I actually want to come back to the idea of training, and also with specific regards to unconscious bias training, but I want to let Her Majesty go first and add her thoughts.
So I'm going to chime in here and just kind of build on the things that are there, because my primary focus is behavior. Before anything else, that is absolutely what we have to look at, is what are the core behaviors. And in order to change those behaviors, you have to identify those behaviors. My background is in sociology and psychology, and therefore my approach to these elements is going to come from those particular things. And I have developed a system of 4 behaviors. We call them the 4 A's. And when you identify those behaviors, whether those are behaviors that are enforced by your policies, whether those are behaviors that keep somebody from a seat at the table, whether those are behaviors that you forget about those other 11 months, we all need to be aware of them. And the 4 A's are animus, which we don't really have to worry about in a professional setting for the most part. There are some companies that's their entire basis. Anxiety, which is, oh, I'm worried about what they're doing in the bathroom. Aversion, which is, I don't want to go in the bathroom and I'm not going to let them go in there. We can't do that. And then the last one is apathy, which is, I'm not going to get involved in that because that's too hard. That's too much. And I don't want to get in trouble. I don't want to cause a scene. It could hurt my business or something else. Those are the 4 A's: animus, anxiety, aversion, and apathy. And they're all behaviors. And while you have to break them all down into chunks and everything else and let people understand those 4 behaviors, when you combine them with the power imbalance in any kind of relationship, you automatically now begin to understand how you end up with situations such as trans people being murdered, such as the kind of violence that's being engaged against Asian and Black Americans, the kind of complete erasure that we see within the indigenous population. These kinds of hostilities, that's it. And while we can all say, we're going to have our little flag, like well, mine sitting back here in the blur, that's just pinkwashing unless we can follow it up with some actual action, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, and I'm glad you brought up those 4 points, because I'm wondering about, as I mentioned after Natalie, about training and what role you can train somebody to see those things and change behaviors. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying, yeah, absolutely. That's it. Keep going.
Well, I just
having identified them.
Well, identifying, and I know that unconscious bias training does illuminate that particular piece of it. Like, you can't change a behavior that you don't even know that you have. But how do you take something like that and make that non-performative, make that more sustainable? Has something come into practice over this last year that has changed the game for learning, especially for allies? Anybody want to raise their hand? Go ahead, Chad.
So I think training and goals and performance management. I think training cannot be the only thing. And I think we train, to Dr. Toni's point, to begin to change behavior. Then we have to hold ourselves, organization, individuals, accountable to moving toward that behavior change. What gets measured matters, right? Mm-hmm. I think the other piece of it too is that we sometimes enter the space of DEI, putting on my old DEI hat, in the context of, well, we need a train to fix a thing. The training will illuminate what actually is the thing that we need to address. Mm-hmm. And then also, there are some behaviors that are rooted in beliefs that are acceptable, and there are some behaviors rooted in beliefs that are not. And I think whether we're talking about the nonprofit sector, the for-profit sector, the healthcare industry, whatever platform we all have, whatever sphere of influence we have, we're seeing and feeling society need to draw a clearer line around the behaviors grounded in beliefs that are not acceptable in the workplace. Racism, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, any kind of phobia that makes anyone feel not comfortable. But it's not enough to just say that in a month. It is important to then weave that into job descriptions, to train toward outcomes, and then to hold us all accountable to that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's a totally different take on the types of diversity training that existed for, I think, since the 60s. I wrote about that, that don't necessarily work in the long term. But people feel like, oh, Dr. Toni, I saw that face. But it's a box checking exercise. Am I right? So what's the antidote to that? Go ahead, Toby.
I think part of it comes down to it's not like training isn't one size fits all, right? It's like people are coming at different levels of awareness, understanding, and empathy, people and exposure to different concepts, and people learn differently, right? Like some are visual, some are more audio, some are, and it's a different learning styles come into play. And then there's the reality, right, of like the forgetting curve. Like within 30 days of a new thing we're introduced to, we forget 90% of that content, right? And that's without repetitive touch and without reinforcement of the, that concept that we've been introduced to, right? And so one thing that we've seen in the last year and some of the work that we do supporting DEIB goals with the organizations we serve at Bravely is combine different formats that extend the tail of repetitive touch and reinforcement, and different environments, similar to what you said, Natalie, like more interactive, smaller group breakouts. And it might be a sort of more didactic, more traditional sort of training where you're exposed to a new concept in a lecture-y kind of presentation format. Then you have a group environment where you can process, and then you have access to individual Bravely sessions to individualize that experience and like react to things or ask questions you were maybe nervous to ask about in a group setting, and or like a tough conversation comes up that's related and you're like, I know we covered this, what is it? I can role play and practice in a confidential space for that conversation. So just we're seeing organizations and DEI leaders finally have a mandate and a budget at levels that they haven't necessarily had historically, and be able, it's far from perfect, but be able to think about really comprehensively about learning and reinforcement and giving people the tools and the resources that they're asking for to give inclusive feedback and lead more inclusively, and with different platforms and different approaches combined in a really intentional instructional design and ongoing support layer, they can deliver that. And then to your point, Chad, it sets the stage for then holding people accountable for it. You can say to your managers, we're going to look at how your team is reporting their sense of belonging, how included they feel, if you're also providing the resources and means to get them there and deliver on that accountability.
I think that's a fantastic point in terms of training and offering training in different ways to trigger people who might need a different learning experience. And I also think that accountability piece is important, but I think the training and the accountability, it has to show up. And the only way it really shows up for a company is when you look at who's being hired, fired, and promoted. If you're training all these folks, but yet the person who is making inappropriate jokes or saying things inappropriately about a trans person, and yet they get the promotion, right? For companies, what you say, yeah, people hear it, but it's what you do. Who are you hiring, firing, and promoting? That says more about the effect of the training and or your systems and or your accountability than a lot of the training mechanisms that we put in place.
Absolutely. Toni, you want to add?
It really does. And for me, one of the things is my team is about to embark on a rather ambitious training cycle. I have 26 clinics scattered over 3 counties in Southern California, and I have to train every single person that we have in 90 days. And we start that 90-day clock from scratch on the 1st of July. So everybody's like, how are you going to do that?
We'll check back in with you after 90 days and see if you're still standing.
Everybody's like, well, how are you going to do that? And I said, we're going to do it the best way we can, which is we're going to utilize the tools that we have. The first part is going to be a required simple training that everybody has to watch. It's a video thing, but then we're going to follow that up with on-site in-person visits and discussions and discourses. And then after that, we're going to have all of the little breakout sessions and so forth. But the other key is we've been working on this overall development and this team building structure for 3 years now. And the first year was, we're going to do the education bit. So we reached a certain level of education that was a bare minimum. We're happy there. That was 1 year of education. The next year is corrective. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at this whole year, and this whole year is about kind of correcting those little flaws. And now it's year 3, and now we're going to be a little punitive. And that also matters because when you're changing behavior does not change. You cannot force a change in behavior. It has to come from inside. And therefore you have to give people time to recognize that, oh, that does improve stuff. My team's motto is, we're here to help. Not we're here to make a change, not that we're here to do anything else. My team's motto is we're here to help you, because we know that if you can do these things better with all of the various minority and other groups that we have to deal with, that your overall business is going to be better, that our overall experience for our patients is going to be better, and that our overall employee experience is going to improve. We know that because we're all of those things. So I think that that's a key function to remember, that as you do this training, you have to keep following up, and you have to make sure that you're not being punitive, which tends to be the reactionary thing that we see. You know, it's, oh, you did that, so we're going to write up a correction. You know, you're going to have to be doing. No, it's the unending coaching that we all love and adore so much. But you do it one-on-one. You're not dragging somebody out in front of the rest of the community to do it. And you're just saying, hey, you know, this is what we're going to do. And now that we've got a chance, we're going to kind of watch you. And for some strange and mysterious reason, when they think they're being watched, they behave better.
Toby, you wanted to add something?
One quick note too is I, as part of this strategy and on this drive toward creating more inclusive cultures and particularly around LGBTQ identities, there's training writ large, like educating folks around microaggressions and stereotype threat, and this, you know, and empowering would-be allies and empowering inclusive leadership from managers. Then there are also the specific needs of different communities and groups within it as well. And something I'm struck by from our session data, we have people who come to Gradely to prep for critical conversations or a performance review, or they just want to work on their career goals and leadership development. It's more on demand, and self-directed by every employee who has access. So they come with the topic, right? And it's not prescriptive. In LGBTQ, a self-identifying LGBTQ person is twice as likely to come to a Bravely session to talk about imposter syndrome than a non-LGBTQ identifying person. There are like specific challenges, even within, in this specific example, LGBTQ leaders who we're saying like they are blazing the trail, they're serving as examples, they're showing it can be done, but they're struggling with their own journeys as part of that in a lot of cases. So there are like specific interventions and policies and programs and things that have to be part of this comprehensive strategy for the community still being underserved and still struggling to feel included, while we're also trying to catch everybody up en masse.
Chad, you want to add something?
No, I think so. Twice as likely, Toby, from an imposter syndrome lens. So here in San Francisco, I have the honor of working for the first openly gay male CEO of a YMCA in the country. Jamie Burning Miles. And I will tell you that a part of why I came to work here as also an openly gay male was because of that. And the conversations that we had, even as part of the interview process, of the subjugation that we hold that continues to be a narrative. It blew me away why CEOs oftentimes will tell their story on a video as a part of a campaign and whatnot. To see Jamie and his husband walking down the street with their dog, talking about their experience in a way that I cannot even explain to you, shot ripples of inspiration through my veins. So I saw Natalie, somebody posed a question to Natalie, love to hear her lens in the chat around training. I do think that sometimes the experiential context, training is great, but it also can fit in the context of real world application. There's nothing like being able to go into my boss's office and we're united and being able to talk through and strategize how we overcome the subjugation that we have, how we reframe when people say wife or they, with he, husband, right? And we really make sure that we get to bring all of our authentic selves to the table. And also in the context of intersectionality, if I could, grounding sort of the punch at culture that we have, where one dimension of diversity is punching at another. It's almost like we're still struggling for who is most oppressed. This is not going to be effective if we play the oppression struggle Olympics or the diversity struggle Olympics. We all are uniquely oppressed. And when we all can embrace the humanity that we share through common sets of lived experiences, then we can find that way forward.
I want to pause briefly here because Steve is going to come back on. Word from our sponsor.
That's right. Thanks, Lydia. I'd just like to remind anyone joining our webinar in midstream that we're from day one. We're exploring progress toward a more inclusive LGBTQ outlook in corporate America. Our sponsor is Bravely. Thank you. And as a reminder, you can submit your questions at any time, and we'll answer as many as we can during the Q&A session at the top of the hour. back to you, Lydia.
Thank you. So Chad, thank you for teeing up the intersectionality part of the program so eloquently by, I like the Oppression Olympics sort of motif that we have here, because this last year has been challenging, obviously, for everyone, and marginalized groups for sure have been suffering an outside impact of the COVID pandemic. But we are nothing if not many things. I'm not just what you see on this screen here, and none of you are either. So this question about intersectionality that I have to believe that this is like one of the first years that people started actually understanding what intersectionality was. I mean, I think that the word was thrown out a little bit before this, but for people of majority groups didn't really think about intersectionality, especially in the workplace. So let's talk a little bit about that and how that can fit into an organization's inclusion efforts. Who wants to start with that? Go ahead, Natalie.
I mean, I'm happy to start, Lydia. I think Chad teed it up beautifully, and I'm just so excited for us to talk about this because I think, unfortunately, the Oppression Olympics is still very rampant in many organizations. There's a lot of still sentiment about what about us, what about me, why are they getting all the focus right now? And I don't know. It's one of those things that keeps me up at night. I don't know how to fix it. I can't tell you right now. But I'm excited for us all to figure that out together as large organizations and even, community organizations. How do we make sure that our causes for equality are not in competition with one another? Because at the end of the day, divided we fall, right? We're a lot stronger together. I think my answer personally to the question about intersectionality, and we have to give Kimberly Crenshaw her credit for coining that term. We have to be honest about how everyone fits into more than one category. I think it's important to ask the tough questions about representation for a lot of the initiatives and programs at your company. I remember, coming up in my career and being really angry, quite frankly, whenever I'd go to a Women's History Month event and everyone on the panel did not look like me at all, or there wasn't a singular Black woman on the panel. But it was equally hard and kind of like a punch in the gut that kind of really fueled and checked me in terms of my allyship, is I had a Black queer woman colleague tell me off to the side, well, Natalie, you're mad about that, but you didn't say anything when the Black History Month panel had no queer representation, right? And so it's really important for us to think about intersectionality across the spectrum and how, let's be honest, you can be really passionate about one cause for equality and still be falling short in another. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's only a bad thing if you decide to sit in that and not do anything about it. So I think another thing we need to talk about, and that's the real tough question as well, is of the underrepresented groups in your organization, are there patterns to who gets to be in leadership? So even, for example, whether it's like Black representation in leadership, what do the people at the top look like? Is there a pattern? In your organization of the LGBTQ senior leaders, are most of them white men? So we need to make sure that we're checking ourselves across the spectrum and joining together to make sure all of us are represented and there's no preferred type of person even amongst these groups. And that's a privilege that I have, and that's a privilege so many others have, but we need to use our platform to advocate for one another.
I definitely want to dive back into that a little more deeply about developing professionals and into leadership. But Toni, you want to add something here?
I do. One of the keys to understanding a lot of intersectionality is that most folks don't get the way that an axis is set up. They don't understand what is an axis for one. And then when you have an axis, you have to have a point on each end. And they don't know what the points on each end are. So when we talk about intersectionality and we're not discussing the concepts of this is separate from that, this kind of oppression is dealt with in a different level, we tend to confuse them when we're doing the training. And then on top of it, a lot of people don't understand that the 2 points on each end are stigma and privilege. You cannot talk about one without having to talk about the other. If you have privilege along this axis, you cannot have stigma along this axis, no matter how much you want to pretend that you do. And so it becomes important when we're educating people to do that. But then once you've reached that point, then you have to be careful of that whole struggle that we sometimes deal with of tokenism. I am the only executive level trans person in my company. Am I a token? Almost all of the trans people that work in the company happen to work for me. Well, now am I breaking my own rules? Am I getting into a thing? No, there's a real rationale behind that. They have a greater understanding of the population in which they work. So I have to be considerate of that. And then on top of it, I am mixed in everything. I'm a bisexual, trans, mixed race person. So for me, the existence of being a liminal human being, not being able to be any single one thing that everybody wants me to be, has taught me a lot about how to perceive those kinds of goals. And that actually comes in handy, because then I can also take it to other people who may have a challenge and say, well, what about if this is the circumstance? How do you handle that? Because I'm usually the one pulling from not only my own personal experience, but from the 30,000 different trans people I've helped over the years. Mm-hmm. So it gives me a greater level of understanding to a great degree, but sometimes communicating that can be a challenge if the background is not there. If people don't understand, these are the axes you have to look for. And it's not something that you can pull off of the EEOC website, because that doesn't even begin to describe all of them. This is something you have to do, and you have to look at within your own company culture, and then begin to identify, break down, and show the differences between the stigmas and the privileges. And you also have to do all of this without ever using the word privilege.
That's not a hard job at all. I'm pleased that you brought up tokenism, because I think that I think we need to have a place for that in this discussion, particularly as it relates to bringing your whole self to work. Very hard to bring your whole self to work if you're the only one of whatever. But that is the reality for a lot of workers in the United States. They're in an organization where they are the only one. So I'm thinking that it's leadership's responsibility to foster a culture that allows those individuals to bring their entire selves to work, as well as everybody else in the organization. What does that look like? How do you achieve that? Because, and especially in this last year, it's been really challenging for people who weren't necessarily comfortable showing their home behind them. You know, they left that part, as I said in the introduction, at the door. And now all of a sudden we're all up in each other's business. So, okay, let's talk about that. How do you encourage people to bring their whole selves to work? Best practices. Let's go.
For me, I have to start with my own experience. The concept of bringing your full authentic self to work, it wasn't around when I first entered this business. It just wasn't. It was sort of, when you get in, fit in, right? Don't stand out. Don't draw attention to yourself. Entering the room, I was always trying to calibrate, because I was the one and the only. I was always trying to make sure I didn't offend anyone, that I didn't come across as being the loud Black female or the angry Black female or whatever the stereotype was that was staring me in my face. So I've never was my fully authentic self at work for the first 4 years. I was always worried about how to enter. And, you know, I'm from the South, you know, there were no gay people in the South. And so I could not be gay. And so I couldn't be gay, I couldn't be Black. I tried to just be a professional. And I just, at some point, remember thinking that I'm never going to enter a room and not be Black. I'm never going to enter a room and not be a woman. I'm never going to enter a room and not be gay. That comes with me. Wherever I go, those things, those layers come with me. And I actually came out at work before I came out at home, because I was able to find people at work who didn't judge me based on any other labels. They just wanted to know if I could do my job well. And so that was that allowed me to be my fully authentic self in other spaces, but it happened for me first at work. So I try to create that for anyone else coming into our organization. I always ask people when they start or when I meet them, what do you need to feel valued at work? What do we need to do to make you feel comfortable, valued, seen, and heard? I ask that question of everyone. And I try to live up to that, and we try to put things in place so people don't feel that knot that I used to feel when I would show up at work every day.
That is a key question. Are there other questions that you can ask of employees to make them feel seen and heard and valued and safe to express themselves? Chad?
I can build that so that you are so profound in what you shared. I mean, I think there are questions, sorry, Lydia, that we can ask, but also, and to Yvette's point, being honest, right? Sometimes it isn't safe, as Yvette was speaking for one to bring one's whole self. Unfortunately, I've been in different situations where we espouse, right, the aspirational goal that everyone should feel comfortable bringing their full self to the table, and then someone listens, and then they do, then it's not, and then it doesn't work. And that's something I think we just have to be honest with ourselves. There's nothing wrong with saying we hope to get there. We're not quite there yet. I can support you this way. To Yvette's point, how can I support you in that way? The other thing I would say too is, you know, when we talk about bringing our full self to work, and Yvette did it beautifully, there's segments of ourselves. I can bring my full self as a gay man. I don't yet feel comfortable bringing other dimensions within my LGBTQ identity to the table because there are layers to that, which means the more marginalized, the more segmented, the more lenses of intersectionality we bring, sometimes we may seem like we have it all together. We're bringing our full self, but really there's so much, you know, the iceberg. People can see the top and maybe the water is receding a little bit, but there's so much that's there because we're coming out of a pandemic, because we're coming out of this reckoning around racial inequality that some folks have just woken up to and others have been aware of for their entire life. It's all coming to a head. So I think just honesty, transparency, meeting people where they are, recognizing that what we can do is lead from our own seat and not expecting others to join us, even if we may share the same lived experiences, and then looking at really being critical about what types of environments we're creating through practice, through policies, through procedure, but also through our role modeling. And Yvette did a beautiful example of that just now.
Toni?
I'm just gonna hop onto that role modeling. That's kind of my whole shtick in a big sense. I mean, as we talked about as we were getting prepared here, I am so out that I don't even realize how out I am. There is nothing about me that is off limits except maybe what I do in my bedroom. And then that depends on how you ask the question and who else might talk. I mean, because that's kind of, it's my shtick. That is how I move through the world. But the benefit to my being willing to sacrifice, you know, some of those elements to my life, and I'm fully aware that I'm sacrificing them for some cause, whether it's a great cause, a good cause, or just kind of what the heck are you thinking? I don't know. But it's still a sacrifice, and my being willing to do that often leads people to feel that they have, you know, the ability to approach me, to talk to me, to come to me and say, I have that sense that you won't be that judgy person over there. I have that sense that I'm able to reach out to you and say, I'm not comfortable being out at my workplace, but you are here and you are out and you have done a lot to make a change here. So I want you to know, as a gift to you for all the work you've done, that you are somebody that I think is doing a good job and that I feel represented by you, which is never my goal. I'm not there to represent somebody else. But what I am there is to make sure that people can feel represented, that they can feel that seen, and that they can always have somebody to turn to and be heard. That's how I view my own role. And I try to teach that to all of the other directors and executives and vice presidents and officers of the company, because that's a key element to being able to be a leader, in my opinion. And it's how you start to establish all of the other stuff that we've talked about. It's it's layers, just in the same sense that, you know, each individual is that iceberg and we only see the top. The flip side of that is the amount of work that you have to do is an upside down one, you know, where you only see on the outside this little tiny bit, which is the action, but all of the stuff to learn that is behind it. And it's a mountain all in and of itself.
I want to talk about professional development though. Oh, Toby, I'm sorry. You wanted to say something, add to that?
I think there are ways in terms of this question of how people bring their whole selves to work, particularly around LGBTQ identity. There are, like, this is a little more boring, I guess, in brass tacks, but there, like, so much of it comes down to these daily micro interactions and in terms of fostering any sense of belonging or driving real inclusion. And there's, as a company, right, like, you want to control your controllables and do everything you can to set the stage for those micro interactions to go well and for people to feel included. And a lot of that comes down, it starts with allowing LGBTQ employees to self-identify in a structured way and in a normative way for the organization. Like, here are our pronoun policies and where every employee lists their pronouns. Every time we start a meeting with a new person, we identify our pronouns as a way of allowing employees to self-identify who they are as a baseline starting point for then feeling like they can show the rest of them. And I think one effective way of doing this that a few tech companies have pioneered is by starting with a new hire onboarding program in that way. Like, it's almost like a Trojan horse for driving cultural change, is just telling your new hires, like, this is how we do something here. Mm-hmm. And it then over time, right, those new hires are operating in that way and it can become the norm for the company. I mean, it's never so simple, right? But it is a sort of tactical way of like, okay, this is a practice we want organization-wide people to do in different conversations, allowing for self-identification as a starting point for acceptance. And, you know, starting with folks who are coming in and new with a blank canvas can be a really effective way of driving that change over time.
Go ahead, Natalie. You wanted to add?
Yeah, not to belabor the point, but I was really inspired by what everyone said, particularly when Chad was talking about honesty. It reminded me of when I was in business school. I was in a bunch of data classes, and one of my professors had once said that data can tell the truth, but still not be honest. And I think about that often, not just with data, but just generally, like human psychology, behavior, diversity, inclusion. And I think we have to be very honest, to Chad's point, that the reality is not that you can bring your full self to work. I think that is something we need to work towards as organizations. But I think sometimes we tend to look at the future of inclusion and we like to look forward kind of with rose-colored glasses. You know, the future is romantic, the future is sexy, equality. You know what I mean? And we don't ever sit in the fact that until we had these conversations, we weren't doing this. And this was not people's experiences. And we saw this particularly last year when we were talking about race, for example. Oh, we're going to do this, 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 and this. And we're not talking about how last week the norm was not to do those things, right? And so we have to keep it real, not only for our LGBTQ brothers and sisters, but everyone in these companies to say, okay, we can't be the solution if you're not willing to sit in the problem. Does your company have exit interviews for any departing employee from an ERG? How often do those happen? Or how often are they reviewed for trends or patterns? If you ask someone in human resources, what are the top reasons people in the LGBTQ community leave this company? Do they have an answer? Have we looked at that, right? And so in order to design the solution, we have to be willing to identify what the problem is and has been, because as Chad was saying, ultimately we say bring your full self to work, but we all know what happens when some of us decide to do that. Right? It's being an underrepresented minority or any underrepresented group in an organization. What usually happens to you, and it's very common still to this day, is very unfortunate. You can get punched in the face 20 times and still the feedback at the end of the year can be, why are you always getting into fights? Right? And so when you are your authentic self, sometimes it has repercussions on you, especially if you're the only one on your team or in your department, because you bring that diversity and you bring a change that often other people aren't ready to receive. And we have to be honest, not just truthful, honest about what it will take to overcome that and dismantle that, so we can be at a place where it's safe to bring your full self to work. And that was what Chad inspired me to think about.
Can I add to so bringing together a concept of intersectionality and honesty. So building off the conversation, and to Toby's point on being aspirational through new higher orientation, I think so. Human conditions allow us sometimes to be comfortable entering some conversations around diversity, but not others, right? When I was working at YUSA, I remember a CEO saying, "We are so on board with the conversation around trans inclusion, but we're not ready to talk about race." And I remember thinking, so that's interesting. And can we then talk about how, if that's the entry point, that is, let's talk about race as a dehumanizing socio-political construct, then the United States means that the first way that people were dehumanized was by the color of our skin. All the other oppressions have to be understood through that lens, which is why when we talk about race and folks sort of lean back, we have to call that out and name it, right? So honesty also in the context of, let's name where we're comfortable. Let's name where we're not. Then let's not get stuck in where we're comfortable, and let's move forward. But whatever the entry point is from a lens of DEI, let's seize into it and have the conversations. And when that door cracks open, stick our foot in and then maybe jam the elbow, and then we slowly nudge it forward from a lens of greater inclusion and equity. But again, a rising tide lifts all ships. I think sometimes companies and individuals and businesses and organizations, we get comfortable and complacent. We see some low-hanging fruit. We get a dashboard, we get a training, we get a cool photo that looks like it's more diverse. We get a CEO that identified a certain way. We get featured on some type of a something, and we start to get pacified. But the work is supposed to get harder the more we accomplish. The work is supposed to get more confusing the more that we dive in, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Toni?
I'm just going to pop in there and say, for me, if somebody tries to come to me and says, hey, we're not ready to talk about trans stuff because we're still not done with the race thing, I go, well, then you're still dealing with me either way. One of the nicest things about being so many different things all at once is that I'm not going to back down from any of them. It's me. I'm standing in front of you. And if you're going to tell me, well, I'm not ready to deal with you, and then I am going to deal with you, and because you can't separate those parts for me. The Black and the Native and the white, they're all the same thing. Those are invisible little barriers that we create. And I just kind of say, trans people don't exist to meet your expectations. We exist to create new ones. And I follow that as my motto for my personal experiences in making those changes.
I have so many tangents here that I'm struggling to put all this together. The very best part of intersectionality is that we're pulling all these threads together. But I'm thinking about allyship for these so-called well-intentioned majority group leaders who are attempting to create a more inclusive environment. Whether they're succeeding or not, I cannot speak to that. And I'm thinking about professional development. I'm thinking about what Natalie said about exit interviews, because retention is a huge part of a measure to see if you are an inclusive organization. You cannot just get people in the door. You have to get them to stay. They need to want to stay. And it's, how would you encourage leaders to create safe spaces so that retention can happen? Let's just leave it there, and then we have to go to our regular Q&A. Toni?
I'm just going to say that the first thing you have to do is remember that there is no division there in terms of what group is the most difficult. Okay, we all have this urge, and I'm sure that everybody here, since we're all people of color, we're all sitting here going, well, Toni, there is that one group of people that we can all identify. But the truth is it's not just them. Yes, there's a whole little structure that supports them and benefits them and everything else, but there's a whole bunch of people who have to work within that structure that tend to reinforce it when they're not even thinking about it. And so you can't walk into it saying, well, I'm only going to try and reach this group of people. Those are the people I want to make allies. If the rest of us all gang up, we outnumber them and we can take them down. To be blunt, that's kind of the way I look at it. But the real key is that some of us are those things. Intersectionality is not just, oh, what's ever there. Intersectionality is we are all in this together. That's the thing that people tend to forget about it when they're trying to make those separations. And as somebody who both knows Kimberly and is also a really big proponent and uses this on a daily basis, That's something I have to be aware of myself, is I'm not going to separate people up. So the first thing I'm going to say is don't come and say, you know, this is only targeted at these groups. And that's also, so I'm going to say everyone, because nobody is immune to this. All of this stuff is something that we were taught and that we had developed as part of our socialization process and a part of our cultural development. There's a word there I just can't say. Our cultural development as we grew up. This was stuff shoved into our heads, and all of us here, one of the things that marks us as separate, in part because we're successful in our industries, is because we've managed to overcome those limitations and all of that education that was shoved into us and question those realities. That's honestly a thing we have to acknowledge. And so that's what we have to do with everybody else.
Okay, pause briefly because we are at the top of the hour. Going to invite Steve back on.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Lydia. Thanks to all of you who are participating in our excellently plain-spoken conversation today about a more inclusive LGBTQ outlook in corporate America. And thanks to our sponsor, Bravely. We're about to respond to your questions, but before we do, in case you missed it at the top of the hour, I'm going to share something special that we have for attendees of today's webinar. Our next monthly virtual conference happens to be Wednesday, July 21st. And it's about diversity's many roles, how mentors, sponsors, and allies each play a part in inclusion. Thanks to today's sponsor, we're offering a complimentary VIP ticket to everyone joining today's webinar. These are normally $149, so now's a good opportunity to grab one. I've placed the link in the chat space again. With that out of the way, at this time, we'll be responding to questions from our audience, and you've sent a bunch of great ones. So over to you, Lydia.
Oh my goodness, yes, there are so many good ones. So we'll try to get to as many as we can. Just want to give a reminder, some of you have targeted specific panelists. I would ask that you reach out to those people directly via LinkedIn or through their organization's website. We're going to try to do as many broad responses as we can. And here's a good one from Cindy. When it comes to goals and holding people accountable, what are the goals and who has them? At the organizational level, I've seen numbers of people from various groups at different levels and starting to see sentiment data broken out by demographic groups. So goals, accountability, who's making them? What do we say? What are some best practices there? Toni?
I'll go ahead and start. I'm just going to say, if you have a diversity officer, in whatever title or form you have, the reason you hired them is to have that. That's their job. That's what we exist for. And if you don't give them the power and the authority and the data and the budget to be able to do that, you're hiring them, and I'm going to ask you why. From a business perspective, are you just trying to look good by having somebody? And if that's the case, can we go, and have our hot dogs? Do we have to show up? Can we just get paid for being there and go find a job where they're actually going to use our services? That's who I would say is the person that you need to look at. And that's who I would put the authority and responsibility on, because we have to be held accountable ourselves for our own actions. And we're the ones who know how to do it. And yes, we might get a little lazy and say, okay, we're not going to track that. But all of us are super dedicated to what we do. And we're going to say, hey, this is the things. If I don't do this, you need to come at me so that I can be held accountable, because the first rule of diversity is being held accountable for your own actions, regardless of whatever else comes along.
Anyone else want to add? Otherwise, we'll go to the next question.
Yeah, I think just to add on to what Toni said, which was on point, as a CDO, I can say, tangent, both my parents are immigrants from Jamaica, and it is a classic Jamaican saying, even though I'm sure we didn't invent it, that fish rots from the head, meaning that it starts at the top. Now, what are your CEOs doing? What are your group, the CEOs, direct reports doing, business unit leaders doing? And so if you're listening and you're in a position to influence that accountability, start with the top, because ultimately people look up to replicate behavior because they want to move up too. But then once that's done, keep moving down in the organization, because we all know that people join companies because of what the company is saying, and they leave companies because of what the managers do. And so no matter how junior you are, if you are managing other people, you need to have a diversity and inclusion and performance goal as well. So I would just say, make it multifaceted. Start at the top, because ultimately, I think it was Yvette said this earlier about culture. One of my favorite quotes that someone said to me a long time ago that I've never forgotten is, culture in an organization is not just what you say or what you write, but it's what you reward. Okay. So if you want to know what an organization's culture is, look at who gets promoted and how they behave, for good, for better, or for worse, right? Because ultimately, even their worst behavior, if they still get promoted, that means what they just did is not that important to your culture. What really matters is what else they did that got them promoted that was positive. So my point is, sometimes we say that diversity and inclusion is the value of a company, but then when you look at who's rewarded, it's really not a value, it's just a preference. So I think it's really important that we hold ourselves accountable in that way as well.
Toby, you want to add?
It's just an extension of what Natalie is already saying, but also offering or tying performance bonuses, not just promotions, but bonuses to inclusion KPIs can be a very practical way of galvanizing the right kinds of behaviors and incentives.
Sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Chad.
This, and I know different sectors, right? So from the Y perspective, I think making sure that we center the voices of the people that we're trying to serve, or if I'm putting on a for-profit hat, well, the people we're trying to get to engage in our services or our products. Sometimes I think in the world of DEI, we get so stuck on what we think others think, as opposed to finding ways to actually engage the people that we serve or are trying to serve this in what they engage. The other thing I would say is just to be a human about it. I think we're in a culture of forced wokeness, for lack of a better term. And I'm new to San Francisco. I'm learning our community here. And I've never been in such a space where there's such a nuanced lens to how we have to frame language. And I would wonder how all of the participants, how we all think about in the companies that we work in, the cities that we live, how that manifests. And then how much of ourselves authentically can we bring of what we know and what we don't know. I think following leaders sometimes means that the leader is aware of what they know, but also what they don't know. They can bring that to the table, as opposed to showing up with all the right words. And then to the points that Natalie and Toby are mentioning, their actions don't match. Then you're left as an employee going, well, you said and you did. Like, what are you? As opposed to consistency in that context.
We have a question from Laura, who wants to know, I've repeatedly seen that required DEI training is not effective. What suggestions does the team have for ensuring that self-exploration is occurring while also individualizing so education has value for each employee? So back to the training question. Do we have suggestions for Laura about individualization?
Well, I mean, I think we talked about it earlier a little bit, Lydia, but I mean, the way I feel about it is, diversity training is not a cure. It's not a vaccine, I hope everyone is getting their vaccine accordingly, but, I am vaccinated. I still wash my hands, right? Inclusion is the same, training is the same way. You get educated, but it's still a skill you have to build every day and something you have to actively be mindful of in your everyday actions. So in that regard, I recognize why the research says that diversity training is not effective, but I would push back on that. What type of diversity training are we talking about? How is it formatted? How often is it given? Are there refreshers? I believe Toby said earlier, the quote or the statistic was, in 30 days, we lose 90% of that content. So if you offer a training once a year, that's way longer than 30 days, right? So how can we make sure that people are constantly not only getting refreshers, but as someone else mentioned, a catch-all unconscious bias training is just scratching the surface. How are we talking about unconscious bias that is commonly manifested towards different groups with different nuances? Like, how can we keep scratching the surface and deepening people's knowledge for different populations and different experiences on how some of the same topics shows up? So I think it's really important that we think about that more deeply.
And I think one of the things too, I really do get the sense sometimes that there is a level of diversity fatigue. Like if I walk into a room and it's like, oh my gosh, the diversity police, right? Like, it's like, whoa, I'm just trying to walk into the room. I'm not trying to be here to be the diversity police. But I think there's a level of diversity fatigue. And I think sometimes if it feels like just compliance and checking a box, then people are going to go through it, check the box, and forget it. If we don't have any real life situations as how it can be applied and practiced in their day-to-day job and why it matters for the work that they do and the environments that they create, you got to really tie it to people, tie it to living better, having a better work environment. Your bonus is going to be impacted. If you don't really tie it to something, I think sometimes it just loses it and it feels, oh, okay, we got to go through this again. Don't harass people. Okay, yeah, but then yet we harass people, right? You know, so we
Well,
got
that's the box checking exercise, right?
we gotta tie it to real behaviors and call out those behaviors and reward those people in a way that is not that doesn't feel like it's just a compliance exercise, that this is how we want our company to be and our culture, and that is how we have to celebrate it. Otherwise it feels fatiguing. It feels like an exercise. It feels like I'm checking a box.
And in terms of a practical concept, put it in your meetings. Everybody has a gazillion meetings a day. If you're like me, you've got 5 more after this. And I'm having a light day. So put it in your meetings. You know, even if it's just 5 minutes, let's talk about real quick, you know, how are we all feeling today? Or, you know, are we all feeling seen? Are we going to have something? Why is this group of people that we're all talking about, why are we all from the same city, in the same state? I don't understand this. Why are we not more diverse? Put it in your meetings. Everybody sees their meetings. Everybody has to go to a meeting. You've all got meetings every single day. I have 26 clinics. Now, one of those clinics has the same basic demographics throughout all of them. And so I have to look at the data for all of them as individuals in addition to the collective. You have to break it down and you have to do it on a daily basis. You have to do it constantly. It's not something that you can fire and forget.
Toby, you want to add?
Final point that you know the more important effort is to get people to show up, right, and in a voluntary context. But there's also some compelling research last year from Boston Consulting Group that shows just having the training in a program, specifically something focused on allyship, for example, has an effect on the behavior of people who actively choose not to participate in it. So if you take 2 companies, one has an ally training program, another doesn't. In the company with the program, folks who never even participated in it are more likely to recognize discrimination and more willing to speak up compared to the employees of the other company without any program whatsoever. So it's the investment is getting there, the impact is getting there even without the direct participation.
And if I can jump in on that too, I mean, I think so. Listening to this conversation, what does not working manifest as, right? As we're speaking to. So a lot of times good trainings do make us as participants feel uncomfortable, right? Because it is driving at something. I remember in the Y World, we used to monitor the trainings that we would conduct. And just anecdotally, 9 times out of 10, when a training did not get good remarks, it was because someone sitting somewhere did not feel good about what they learned about themselves in the context of training. What's the purpose of our training, right? If we're trying to make ourselves uncomfortable so that we can level the playing field, so that those with privilege and those without start to have a commonality of understanding the lived experiences of both, what is the measure? Like, I think it's hard. If I can channel my former colleague Jess Rojas for a second, the patriarchy oftentimes says that we measure everything that we do, including in DEI, from the context of the lens of those in power. Quantitative metrics, not qualitative. Does it work? Does it not? Would you recommend this training to others? No, I wouldn't, because it made me feel uncomfortable about myself. That doesn't mean it wasn't effective. It just means I wouldn't recommend it to others. So really diving into that, and how do we think about our trainings in a new and experiential way, as some folks were saying, and then also how do we not stick to the script? So I think in the world of DI trainings, oftentimes there's little handbooks, right? And those are good and those are important. But the human condition that can get brought to the table to enhance the shared collective commonality, that's huge also, if that makes sense.
We have a related question from John. Do we make colleagues feel nervous, as Yvette made mention? At some point along the way, don't we also have a responsibility to make those who are trying to understand DEI, et cetera, to feel comfortable, even if they say the wrong thing? So that's the flip side of this equation. What about that?
No, because the comfort is the norm. That is the standard, that's the baseline, that's how it exists. And it seems really autocratic or anything else, but if you want to be comfortable, then that means you want things to not change. Because I'm gonna tell you, I don't feel comfortable anywhere. I don't trust cisgender people. It doesn't matter what the circumstance is, what anything else is, I don't trust you. And you want me to feel more comfortable suddenly? Well, if you want to make me feel more comfortable, then start being uncomfortable. Meet me where I am in the same way that I'm trying to meet you where you are.
Building on what Toni just said, which was incredible, I think that we have to go back to the fundamental understanding. Like, for example, like disagreement does not mean disrespect, right? Or just because I said something you don't want to hear doesn't mean I was rude, right? Like, so we tend to kind of think or conflate those two things where discomfort means anger or disrespect or, wow, they really came at me. I'm uncomfortable on a roller coaster, but that doesn't mean it's bad for me, right? That doesn't mean I was harmed. That doesn't mean that I will never do it again, right? So we think about, to Toni's point, comfort and growth do not coexist. So if you're going to a diversity training where you were never stretched to think differently, or you were never confronted with something that was beyond your scope of awareness, then you didn't learn anything, right? We want people to learn. That doesn't mean hitting them over the head with a baseball bat and causing them pain, right? But I just feel like sometimes we get lost, particularly as professionals, when we think about diversity training. We think, discomfort means disrespect or even harm. You can learn something new. You can learn, to experience someone else's discomfort. You can learn about the discomfort that other people have been going through for their whole lives because of your comfort, without feeling like someone punched you in the face for sport, right? I think it's really important that we normalize the fact that we should all be uncomfortable. And quite frankly, some of us have been uncomfortable for a very long time, and you're just now getting this information. But you can either sit in your discomfort and be upset about that, or you can take in the discomfort and say, wow, this is uncomfortable. How can I be part of the solution at the end of the day?
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, that's, my screen is a little bit frozen. Does anyone else want to add something? Otherwise, we can go to the next one. A question from Sarah. How do we overcome leadership or managers' bias against diverse workers and who are more critical in the assessments or skeptical of the achievements of diverse workers?
I'm happy to answer this one too.
Go for
sorry,
it.
I'm very passionate about this. I think,
that's okay.
like I said earlier, we have to make sure that diversity training and expectations and accountability and performance is measured for all people managers. But I also will ask the provocative question for any organization. When was the last time your HR department went through specifically diversity for HR training? Because ultimately, some of us in diversity sit within an HR function, some of us sit outside. I've been in both situations. There's pros and cons to each. We can talk about it another day. But at the end of the day, human resources usually is directly involved in either decision-making or processing performance decisions, hiring decisions, punitive decisions, terminations, all of these things. And of course, on the more negative side, for example, employee relations, complaints, all of these things. And so your human resources, I say this all the time at National Grid, we are the conscience of the organization, right? And so if your average HR business partner can't define what a microaggression is, how are you expecting the average manager who's an engineer or someone who works in a lab or, you really have to start at not only the top, which is your senior leaders, but also the people that are in the room who are supposed to be more than anybody else looking out for how people are treated and experience working at the organization. So I hope one day that's not a provocative question. When was the last time your HR department went through specifically diversity training for themselves as HR professionals? And I hope to see that change a lot going forward.
If I can piggyback on that, sorry, go ahead, Tony.
No, you go first. You first.
So I think questions, right? So if I'm role playing for a second, someone is making a comment about another employee whose dimensions of diversity may be different around their performance. For me, I would say, help me to understand what is the behavior that is challenging around that. Like just drilling in, like, oh, well, someone doesn't perform as quickly. Help me understand how that manifests for you, right? Just trying to hone in, and by asking questions that are pointed but kind, oftentimes we can help. If we are in a position of safety and authority, we can help our peers to understand how there might be a lens of microaggressions or bias that was embedded in some of their decisions or approaches. But part of that requires safety. So I think what I'm saying is, for those of us that are on the webinar that are in positions where we can influence organizational policy and company-wide practice, it's incumbent on us to do so, not to just follow the status quo, not to just perpetuate the challenges of a system that we survive to get to the point of where we are, like someone said earlier, but we do have a responsibility to change it. And so a mentor of mine told me this once: every time we want to make a statement and a point, ask a question instead. Every time we want to make a statement or point, ask a question instead, and help that person to get to that understanding of them. And you know what? Some people might not get it. That's cool too. Maybe they shouldn't be supervising people at a certain point, but there's a way to help us get to an understanding at that level.
So I'm going to use the example of having to approach my actual CEO. I follow a two-step process. The first step is, so this is what we need to teach our employees. We need to teach them to be aware, that when they're dealing with a patient, they shouldn't be, particularly apathetic about the needs of that patient. When we're talking to that individual, they shouldn't be having anxieties about it. They shouldn't be worried about what they're going to do in the bathroom. They shouldn't be worried about, what they have under their clothes or whatever else. And of course, I'm using a trans thing, but there's other elements that you could apply in the same thing. They shouldn't be aversive to it. It's, well, I don't want to work with that kind of person. For one, if you don't want to work with that kind of person and that's what we work with, then you probably don't want to work with us. And you get them to sign off on these basic things. And then once they've signed off, what they've said, whether they are aware of it or not, is that they agree. And then you use those questions and you say, so boss, we have a person here who you don't feel is being particularly, productive because of some level of anxiety. I was wondering if you could tell me about that. Because we want you to live up to the standards that you set and you agree with, and I have no problems whatsoever doing that. I will confess that one of my problems is I'm a very subversive thinker. I undermine your normal expectations. That's what I do. It's how I get through life. I have to. It's how I survive. And that gives me the ability to come at somebody from a different thing. That's not a skill or capability that everyone has. In my case, it's just kind of part of who I am. I'm going to look at whatever authority figure is coming at me and say, do you really want to be that way? Or do you want to be better? Mm-hmm. Because in my experience, everybody wants to be better. And so that's what I help them to come up with.
Toby?
The scenario in this question touches on the idea that managers and leaders have this outsized influence in assessing performance, and they're bringing their lens to it, their biases, and trainings can help with that. But we've also talked in this conversation about the time horizon for behavior change and how long it really takes. And while I certainly believe in all the things we've been talking about, I also, sometimes when we have these conversations, the person getting that unfair representation of or assessment of their work is presented so passively, but they're an active participant in this conversation. And one of the things I'm most proud of the work we do at Bravely is helping people on both sides of those conversations, prepare to maximize it and prepare to communicate success in terms that any manager is going to interpret objectively as hitting the goals that were set, or asking for more clarity and precision about what the measures of success and performance look like here, asking for specific feedback, and going into those conversations equipped with the right questions to ask, having role played to practice how they might respond if they hear certain things that they've heard before that triggered them or felt unfair or divorced from their work. And so I think marrying our sort of top-down investing in leaders with a bottoms-up thinking about daily practices and processes that drive the organization, and equipping every individual with to be an active, successful participant in those conversations, and frankly, in some cases, prepare for the worst, where they know they could expect bias to impact the kind of assessment that they're getting. So, that's some of the work we do, is just thinking holistically at every level what you can be doing to enable and support inclusive behaviors. And we think just only going top down is, it's a long road to success.
We have another question, which I believe I'm interpreting this correctly. I hope I am, David, about intersectionality. When using pronoun usage as a starting point, aren't we just touching on the area of gender identity? Any suggestions on how to advance beyond that? Is it lead by example? Something else?
If I can maybe take a stab at that. So I think pronouns are an entry point to how we self-identify. It's one manifestation of that, one critical one. So I don't want to I don't think the questioner was either minimize gender identity, but it's not an either or, it's a yes and, right? If we're able to self-identify around our pronouns, then we can self-identify around our race or ethnicity or mental health dimensions of diversity or our age or our ability or all the other things. It just puts I think Toby just said this, it puts the responsibility in the hands of the individual to identify who they are, instead of letting the collective or the world look at us and decide for us who we are. Also, pronouns are helpful for everyone, right? I think sometimes too, it's when something is helpful for a smaller group, we perceive that it's not helpful for the majority. Let's be real. Being able to know someone's preferred pronouns or pronouns, however that's termed, is helpful to everyone, period.
Toni, you want to add something real quick? Because I want to get to one more question before we get
I promise I'll make it quick. For one, pronouns aren't optional, so there's no preferences involved, which was obviously recognized, and I appreciate that. A lot of people ask me why it is that my pronouns tend to make people laugh. Aside from being a great icebreaker, I'm dead serious. Those are my pronouns. I'm not pretending. And part of the reason I'm not pretending and that I chose those pronouns is that there are people who have other pronouns nobody understands. And by saying you have to use mine, and with the understanding that I'm in a position of authority to be able to do something if you use the wrong ones, when somebody comes in and they have unusual pronouns, people are going to say, oh, okay, I'll use them. So yes, there is that level of, modeling it, as well as being able to understand that this is just a foot. This is, as was pointed out, this is the ability to say, this is who I am, and it's the simplest, most basic thing you can do to make everybody else come to you to understand who you are, instead of deciding for themselves who you are.
Okay, I want to do a speed round on this one because I think it's really important. I recently received feedback from some employees, and this is from Caitlin, thank you. Our current inclusion and diversity efforts are identity politics and encourage social Marxism. This is definitely not the majority opinion in the company, but a few bad apples can spread this opinion. I tend to get this feedback more during Pride Month when we fly the pride flags. Here's the question. Please help me understand from a pride perspective how I can combat these claims in an effective way and get these employees back as allies. This is a speed round, folks, so you're going to have like 30 seconds to answer this, but I want to get this topic of allyship on the radar here.
First off, don't try too hard. Make being an ally part of your overall standards that you judge somebody on in their reviews. And then, let them express themselves. It's one of the things about pride is it's about expressing yourself. Even if you want to be wrong, you can be wrong.
Someone else want to add?
I think, and I will try to make this under 30 seconds, but I'm just outraged by that. Not the question, but the fact that we still have to be talking about that, because I think ultimately all you can do, you cannot police beliefs, but you can police behaviors. So all you can do is reiterate over and over again that at this organization, wherever you work, that this is a value of ours and this is what we expect, right? You can believe whatever you want, but if you don't work here, your actions need to be aligned with our values, right? And ultimately it's sad, unfortunately, and it continues to be traumatic for many that human rights continue to be a political issue. And I didn't have a choice in that, but ultimately as an organization, you can say, we decide, our value is that everyone here is treated with dignity and respect, no matter who they are, who they love, what they look like, it don't matter. And if you've got a problem with that, please exit stage left. I don't need to know who you voted for, but this is what we do here, right? And of course, on the back end, enforce that. Don't just say that and then let bad behavior ruminate and go unchecked, right? But I hope that was 30 seconds. But my point is, you're gonna, if you respond to every complaint like that, that's more than a full-time job. But ultimately, that time you better spend reinstating and restating the positive of the value that you have and setting those expectations, because you can't fix everybody, but you can set the standard for what's expected.
And I think that the organization has to be firm in its values and its commitment, and have the courage to stand by that commitment, and give employees who don't believe in that culture or those values, make sure that they understand they do have the right to leave.
All right, folks, I can't believe I have to stop you here, because I could talk about this for like another 2 hours. Thank you so much. Chad, Toni, Toby, Natalie, Yvette, you've been wonderful. I'm so grateful to be with you all today. Steve.
Thank you, Lydia, and all our wonderful speakers. Lydia, you really asked an energetic question at the very end. Chad, Natalie, Dr. Toni, Toby, and Yvette, thank you. It was a great conversation. And thank you again to our sponsor, Bravely, and all of you for participating today. If you'd like to join us for more virtual events, you can head to our website, fromday1.co, and check out more of our upcoming webinars. Thanks very much.